morning, everybody. So, we have a lovely hour and a half together. For young people to think, oh God, an hour and a half, this is that guy in the front row, and on and on and on. But I promise you the hour and a half will fly by much faster than you think possible, especially for me. But the first thing I want to do is ask you a couple questions because you will soon see there's a reason that we're here today. The first question is, do you think that Charles City, Iowa is a very historical place? All right, Batman, can you please tell us why is Charles City? For those who can't see me in the Batman house, I know kids these days. So why is Charles City, Iowa a historical place? Historical, not hysterical, historical. Tick, 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 tick. Contestant number one. Anybody else? Is Charles City, Iowa a historical place or not? Yes. Louder. Is it true that the first Tractor was made here? I don't know. Is it true?
Quite fun.
This is difficult. When I was in Brazil, the Brazilians have the story that the Brazilians were the first ones to take a flight. We also the White brothers did in the Carolinas. I don't know, I wasn't there. I'm old, but not that old. I know that Charles City was important in the early tractor history. I don't know if it's the first. Some say yes. I'm not going to sign my name without lying. And any other ways that Charles City is a historical place?
Your last place where we met somebody.
All right.
Yeah, 1930s or 20s, we had a lynching on the Main Street Bridge. Some white guy killed some people. We got to hang him.
It's sort of infamous, isn't it? Well, I'll show you that Charles City is more historical than you think. Any of you play golf? Any of you play golf? Is called Wildwood? Anybody play golf at Wildwood? What happened at Wildwood Golf Course? Could you play this? I love this open up right now. Please look at a board.
Most documentaries about prisoners of war tell of the extremes. Extreme hardships faced by POWs from many wars in many nations. And during World War II, there's no denying that many of the 130,000 American prisoners of war faced grim conditions, cruelty, and even death at the hands of their captors. Despite these undeniable facts, not all prisoner of war camps were unbearable. This is the story of POWs from Germany who were held in nearly every state in our nation, including Iowa. Prisoners of war in Iowa? Yes, by the thousands. Algona, Iowa, which then had a population of about 5,000, was a POW hub, which could hold 3,000 POWs, and was responsible for distributing 10,000 prisoners to more than 30 branch camps in Iowa, Minnesota, and the Dakotas. Obscured by time and fading memories, this story has resurfaced in recent years, in part because of an organization called Traces, run by a man named Michael Louis Trans. Michael, an author, lecturer, and historian, followed his quick roots to study the social impact of World War II. He has immersed himself in the study of relations between Iowans and Germans who have World War II connections, conducting personal interviews with former POWs in Germany.
I think Iowans in general were very generous to the Germans, very hospitable, tolerant, especially in the time of war. If you consider that their own sons were off fighting in Europe and Asia, it's quite a feat to be about to lose a loved one, potentially, and yet to receive, quote, the enemy and treat him with kindness.
Michael found in the POWs a warmth toward Iowa and the people that met here. The families of POWs expressed curiosity about those times and this place. The feeling seemed so strong that in 2002, Traces set up a guided tour so the Germans could touch that history and share their stories with Americans.
The work here was okay and they were treated well. At this time I came here to know where my father once lived and worked, and I hope I can understand my father living
stopped at one of the most unusual prison camps, one of the few that still stands. It is the Wildwood Golf Course Clubhouse in Charles City. Local history buff Tracy Sweet remembers when the POWs were housed in this building.
When I was 6 years old, my mother brought me out here. I do remember I have some very vivid memories. There was barbed wire, and I do remember seeing soldiers milling around. But some friends of mine remember that they were building houses, prisons in Charles City. And her parents said, don't go over there, there's German prisoners over there, so let's run away with the kids went to see them. And everybody in the town got along. I never heard anything bad about these people. They were good workers, they were clean. I heard that this floor in this room, they kept it so clean that they had to refinish it afterwards, so they wouldn't varnish it off the floor by keeping it clean.
In Algona, once the main hub of POW activity, the barracks are all gone. They were cleared away to make room for an airport. But local historians have been collecting stories from those times. When the German families visited,
So during the film, your smarty pants teacher comes over and says, oh, we were younger ones, weren't we? But he doesn't know is that's the good twin. No, it's like it is me. So I showed that film this morning because you kids live in Charles City, I assume. I'm today at the first program of 50 tour stop, 50 stop tour, sorry. And I won't show that film in every town, but why am I showing it in Charles City this morning? Why only here, only you? Alright, these guys are on the ground, and it's really how I can see it. Because there's a history that you don't know about everywhere. In your hometown, there were hundreds of German prisoners in World War II. They were working at Salisbury Labs. They were working at Blackmore Nursery, or whatever it's called, Blackmore Nursery. Sherman Nursery, thank you. They were trucked over in farm trucks to Rockford. They worked at the brick and tile plant, which is now the Fossil Prairie Park. So these boys were everywhere. They were sent to Orchard, they were working near Floyd, they were building buildings, they were harvesting. All that was happening while your grandparents, or most of you, your great-grandparents, they were going to school, going on dates, reading the paper, going to the films. So while we're leading our daily lives, there are historical things of great importance that are happening, but who knew? I don't think he knew about Charles City.
I didn't know their house was wild.
All right, so we're here to learn and here we started. He's going to do me now a new favor and show a short clip. I want to ask you about this film, so pay attention because you're next. Okay, so here's the question. Who were those people? What were they doing? The KKK. What is the KKK?
Ku Klux Klan.
And what were they doing in this film? Where were they marching? From the Capitol toward the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue. Past what's now Mr. Trump's hotel, the old post office building. So why were they doing that? Why were they marching, and how many were they? You guys remember, I'm up here, but not there. They were showing their power. Did they have a lot of power? They had some for a short time. We're going to come back to this story, but this story has a lot to do with something that happened 10 years earlier, and this is our first story. So, I'd like to talk about kicking the Kaiser. Not only is today the first day of the 50-stop tour, but there are 4 different topics. And today we're going to have here at least 2 of them at your high school. A third one will be at the library at noon, and the 4th one will be in Hampton tomorrow. So you might want to invite your parents or grandparents if they can come at noon to the library in Charles City, or tomorrow at the library in Hampton. It is called indeed this series, The Kaiser. The killer. What is that? What is going on the screen? Oh. And sorry about our graphics completing this. We've got the plan and the cow war. And all four of these stories dovetail together to talk about Midwest social history, 1914 to 1934. It's a slice of time that actually is a mirror for what's going on in our world today. First one is about King and the Kaiser. And this is about anti-German hysteria here when the United States blatantly entered World War I. And we start off with these two flags. One is the Imperial German flag during World War I, the American flag with part of our symbol, the eagle, and this is represented the German Americans felt torn. Many of them were fresh immigrants from what we know as Germany, and they didn't really know who to be and who to support. If we're going to understand, though, the reaction of non-German Americans to Germans among them, we have to go back a bit to talk about German Americans in this country at all. In total, there were about 8 million Germans who left what we call Germany and came to the United States. More millions went to Chile, to Australia, to South Africa. So Germans were on the move. Those that came here settled across the country. This map in the 1870s shows where the most Germans were. Do you see Milwaukee in southeast Wisconsin? They call Milwaukee Little Germany, but St. Louis was a German city, Cincinnati, Columbus, Des Moines, Davenport. In fact, the suburb is Dappendorf, village of the Reds. So why did the German settlers almost all stay above the Ohio River and what's now the West? Why did they go in large numbers to the South or the West or to New England? Why the Midwest? Any guesses? Here's one of the answers. The German immigrants hated slavery. They hated it. They just had a failed revolution in 1848 when some of their best thinkers tried to set up democracy, give her their king. It didn't work. They hated their heads. Some of them ran in Wisconsin, Illinois. The early Republican Party was founded largely by Germans who tried to set up democracy in what we know as Germany. For example, this woman and her husband fled the failed revolution, and you know her work. Anybody know her name? But you know exactly what she did in Watertown, Wisconsin in the 1850s. Margaret Schultz instigated kindergarten. That's why we have the German word in English, the garden of children, because of her work, and her husband was later President Lincoln's foreign secretary. So even today, the large ethnic group in America, it isn't the Hispanics. If you take all those Hispanics in the census records and you break them down to Mexican Americans, Cuban Americans, Guatemalan Americans, Germans are still the largest ethnic group in this country. Who has German ancestry? 1 second. Mother. The question is, who's got it? Just because you're my mom. All right. So, right. Very good. More people in America have German ancestors than have English ancestors. And English is the daily language of the country. It says a lot. So once these people arrived at Castle Garden or later Ellis Island, they spread out across the country. And I'm going to give you 3 quick biographical examples. Again, it traces some history and culture. We try not to blather on and on and on about history in some abstract terms, but rather specific. So for example, look at my mother's great-grandparents. They came from northern Germany. They were peasants. And her grandfather is the fellow on the right. There was 3 brothers. By the way, they all later lived at White Osage in Mitchell. They had Uncle Herman, one in the background, had a store west of Osage. Dixie, which now is here, later named Sister Maria or Mary. So the tramps, for their part, left that village on the left, across Lee. And this is a map of this is in the 50s. They left by boat. They got to Milwaukee. Again, Milwaukee was like little Germany. And once they arrived in Milwaukee, they set themselves up and later found out across Wisconsin. Now, the story is true. It's that my mother's grandfather got a job on the railroad crew, went to applying water for in a local farm spring, met this girl who was also being watered at the spring, of course, they married, and they took covered wagons out to the covered territory. Now, the brochure on the left is in German. In fact, this is the back of that same brochure. It's a land aging brochure. It's in German. They have versions in Bohemian, they have versions in Norwegian, they have versions in probably Dutch. So all the big land companies do bring these suckers, the settlers from Europe, who are all living out of villages, and give them almost free land in the West. Yoo-hoo, it's a bonanza. Now, what I need to say is that a lot of people went out there, they followed the railroad lines, where we went a little bit ahead of them, and they built a side house. That's my mother's grandfather on the right, his bride toward the door, his mother in front of the door. They eventually came back to the Mason City, but it's part of a larger push. Now, this picture is well known, it's not in the history books. It's painted by Johann Gass, or when he got to American Germans called John Gass. What?
Manifest Destiny.
Manifest Destiny, very good. And I think it's really called The Progress of Civilization, or something like this. I don't want to diverge too far. Historians love to get obscure points. But look at the hair color of Columbia, the woman floating across North America. She's not very dark-skinned, is she? Okay? So already in the 1850s, 60s, you got this problem of the Europeans, they're going to bring civilization to all the dark continents of the world, Australia, Africa, North America. Notice that they're chasing out the bear, the wolf, the Indians, and on the right is the Brooklyn Bridge in New York. Anybody know who designed and built the Brooklyn Bridge? Roadway, German, from Turingen. I live in Turingen. So all these things are connected. You might not know the stories. It doesn't mean that they didn't happen, and it doesn't mean they don't influence you as they do. We'll get back to that and talk about the Klan. And there's a connection here between the Klan and all this. So the Lewicks, for their part, got to Belmont in the 1850s and wrote letters back to the relatives of Michigan that hadn't come. We could stand in the door of our cabin and we watched the buffalo wade across the Iowa River. So the Sioux, the Lakota, the Dakota, they were all living from the buffalo. What's that? Those are buffalo skulls. And why? We made it into a sport. Even future President Roosevelt went on a train to the Dakotas. They would sit as a sport, as a hobby, kind of activity. They would sit in the train and shoot the buffalo from the train window and just fly them to rot. There were 60 million buffaloes when white came in the 1830s, 40s, 50s in the Midwest. And by then, how many were 1,000? From 60 million, those are skulls being dried out to be ground into fertilizer. There were buffalo robes. They had buffalo skin caps, buffalo gloves. They were cheap. 60 million to be had just for shooting. This is life rabbit trams on our farm. Think about the Native Americans lived in the grass because the buffaloes were eating that prairie grass because they lived in tall grass prairie as opposed to grass, which is mixed grass prairie out for the west short grass prairie. And we settlers also lived in grass. But instead of giving it to buffalo, we gave it to cows. All right? So we came and searched the same thing the Indians needed, and that was the abundance of that deep prairie topsoil. This is what we made out of our piece of buffalo grazing ground. The second buffalo story, I don't really need to talk about my family, but it's the one I know best, and it could be your family, or your neighbor's family, or your uncle's family, actually our family. The Lewis came from Essen, which is Stuttgart, and near Stuttgart, which is now the home of what? Porsche, Mercedes-Benz, you get the idea. In those days it wasn't doing so well, and people like our ancestors left because they were hungry. This, by the way, is the permission to leave. We all have this, we have a lot of legends about the American historical experience that aren't really true. Like we had the idea, all these poor Europeans on ships to sail off for America. It wasn't that easy. They had to apply in most places for permission. Europe in this period was at the end of the Middle Ages, and these parents basically belonged to the local king or the prince or the graf or the duke or whatever. They had to get permission and apply. They had to leave. I can't read it again, and I have it in my notes. Like 1,200 gold coins. Why? Why did they have to leave 1,200 singing about North America, and the other thing that peasants had to agree with, they had signed, they would never again take up arms against the king of Württemberg. I've got news for you, none of the words will come back to fight the king of Württemberg. Anyway, so this is, again, I know a story that you probably don't know. That's important. Like millions of other Germans who were hungry or didn't want to fight the king's army, or a few, but it's the minority, the Amish, the Mennonites, the Brethren, they went for religious reasons. But it's a myth that all these people left for religious freedom. Some did, but it wasn't a majority. They left to have a better life. They went to Michigan, did their army under France, from the Havre, and they came to a country that didn't include Texas. Imagine when your great-grandparents, or in your case, great-great-great-great-grandparents came. In our case, it was from Texas. It was a different country. Some of us migration to Texas. We're still not the country, but that's a different topic. And at any case, in the 1830s, the Whigs were in New York. That's what happened in the 1830s. They got on ships, a lot like some of your ancestors. They went up the smaller boat of Hudson until they got to the Erie Canal. And then took a canal boat to Buffalo, across the Empire State, what's called the Empire State Building. And they spent the winter in 1832-3 Buffalo before going to what town is this? Detroit. Okay? So every town was once a crossroads, a white spot. That's Detroit in the 1830s. Our people were lucky they found a job. Detroit had just burned and it was being made out of new. So like Washington, D.C., they ran boulevards. They got a job building the first railroad from Detroit to Ann Arbor. Have you been to Ann Arbor? It's not very far from Detroit. But you know what's really interesting about this? This is 1833. How many miles or kilometers of railroads were in Germany in that period? How many miles of railroads were in Germany in the Louisiana history? 0. The first railroad in Germany opened in 1835 to the movement out before it. So our people, your people, can do things here they can never dream of doing in the whole world. So they came with all this hope, all these dreams of unlimited possibilities, and many ways it was true. Okay, all right, that's fair. So this says a lot. All those Europeans got on ships. They didn't know if they survived the trip. They didn't know if they'd get cholera on the way. They didn't know if robbers might get them. They didn't have them out in the streets of New York. But they came anyway to have a better life. And they dreamt of a better life for them, for their kids, and for their grandkids, and for you. You're the people that they didn't know that they were doing this for as well. So the German experience is a lot about the American experience. Longer story being very short. The Louis settled in Ann Arbor, was called Klein Deutschland, Little Germany, and literally all the red farms were owned by German settlers. So you see that people came like in Decorah, all those Norwegians, or the Czechs at Koberlin or Spillville. People came and settled largely on their own kind. So you have German institutions that grew up to serve the Germans. So once they built their homes, cleared out the forest, and made their first fields and their first farms and such, they built schools. Some of us in the room actually attended some of the schools, like my mom, probably. And the Germans set about building the first churches in the world. Of course, these are some of the Lutheran churches. Notice they tend to be in the West, because that's what the Germans were. Here's one in Chicago, the Evangelical Lutheran St. Matthew's Church. In Dusseldorf or Berlin, that happens to have been in Chicago. They brought their culture with them. All these buildings downtown, pre-20th Charles City, a lot of them were European style. They brought the old world with them the new. The first Jews who came to what's done in the United States were from Bohemia, German speakers on the left, that's during the Civil War, when Orthodox Jewish clothing in their uniform. For their part, the Whigs in Michigan set up a factory. And the German immigrants in general were very cliquish in a way. They tended to put a lot of their attention on their families, and it was sort of like the German mafia. It was within the family that business deals were made, and they paid a great deal of attention to the children were married. Would they prove their fortunes in America? Would they complete their good luck? And so the Whigs, here they are opposing some of the workers and their sons and their brothers. When they got to Iowa, they were banks. They had an empire of beef and banks. At least outside the family, not ours. We were just poor ones. But anyway, the Germans prospered, and to feed that German American appetite, there were thousands of German language newspapers. We'll come back to that in a minute. How many German language newspapers in America today? The last one I knew of filled in New York last year. The Germans brought their beer garden. Okay, a garden outside they drink beer, even on Sundays, which the Puritans didn't like. They started choral band societies. Remember Glee, this TV series that everyone's really wild about? The Germans were really the ones pushing Glee clubs and singing Vereine, all right? Groups that would go around with concerts. John Philip Sousa was half Portuguese, half German American. He was the American band leader of the 19th century. German choruses, they had often chorus conferences and competitions. Here's a German Turnverein or a gymnast club in the 1850s. So you can see these people, the German American baseball team in Milwaukee, all through the culture. German Americans were visible, their language was being spoken in the streets, just like the Danes. You get sometimes Danish, you get Swedish. People kept their languages. It's not uncommon that many of the grandparents of your families spoke their immigrant language until World War II. My grandfather could speak some German. That's the Turnverein, the gymnasium. One of the things we show is the skeletons of all this culture disappear. These are buildings in New York City with German in the bricks. This is the fire we would take, the free library. And this is Schaefer Hall, where the German social groups would meet, have a beer. In fact, if you look at it closely, you'll see this says, Einigkeit macht stark, which means unity makes you strong. And again, the Germans were pushing social bonds rather than all individual doing their own thing. Now, you know the German culture and folly solutions, you didn't even know it. Santa Claus, it's not from the Brits, it's from the Germans. The Germans were the ones who brought the Christmas tree. Here they are in the corner of Pennsylvania, probably, with the nativity scene. That's all German cultural travel. It's like the Easter egg, and all the chicks and the egg pies. Those aren't the Brits or the French or the Danes, because it's everybody's from the Germans. Now the third biographical example I'll give you before we talk about the war itself is someone you know. All of you know this man. Anyone recognize this guy yet? Can you raise your hand? I'm not going to all at once. He left the Rhineland in the 1880s, came to New York, and realized that with the discovery of gold in Alaska, the Yukon, he can make a lot of money. So he got into his little train car and pedaled over to Seattle and up the passage to the Klondike. He opened restaurants. Notice, by the way, the fine print. Elegantly furnished private boxes for ladies and parties. Kids, I don't want to deprive you of your innocence, but do you know what that means? Private boxes for ladies and parties. You're up in the wilderness of Alaska. What ladies are in the wilderness of Alaska? They're not ladies. So, he was making money renting a place for minors to have a good time with the local hookers. And he learned, oops, I'm just going to throw this over that. And he was outfitting the guys, selling them tools, scales. Who is this character? You all know the family, all of you. Someone who doesn't know him. He went back to Germany after making a lot of money, and he called a wife in the village of Karlstadt, which is near Mannheim. And then the German prince said, oh, you skipped out of military service when you left. If you don't leave right now, you'll be in prison. So the man went back to America, all those language might go with it, which she did. And they got to New York. And here is the family that founded. Who is it? The little kid on the right is Fred Jr. The Trumps. That's the president's family. All right? So there's three notable American families that we studied, but the last was the Trumps. They were also Americans. By the way, a factoid that after the beginning of World War II, the Trumps said they were the Swede. Why did the Trumps say they were the Swede, not the Germans? Because they didn't want Jewish real estate consumers to avoid them. They wanted to sell to Jews as well. And they said, they're Swedes, not Germans. So, I give you a fact background of German culture. What happened when World War I began? We were on the sidelines and eventually we joined in. The turning point is this telegram. This is the Zimmermann telegram. It's when the German government had the very bad idea to send a coded message to the Mexican government saying, you know what, if you join the war with us against the Americans and we conquer the United States, you can take back all the territory that the Yankees stole from you, which, by the way, took out Mexico. All right? All of California, you got New Texas, New Mexico, Arizona is much part of New Mexico. Well, that angered the people, and we joined the war for that and other reasons, and overnight, there was a German hysteria that any German was bad, and Germans were dangerous, even though we were the largest ethnicity group in the whole country. So here's a sign up in suburban Chicago: danger, pro-Germans. All Americans, welcome to Edison Park, Illinois. Problem was, this kid in Iowa, as our young men began to be drafted into the war against the Kaiser, you had to do something to motivate all those German American boys to go to Europe and shoot their cousins. Because it's actually not a natural thing to go somewhere and shoot. You have to keep them all hopped up. So the propaganda machine was primary to this. For example, here's one example. From the vantage point in America, pro-Germanism shoots in the back with poison bullets, our boys over there. I don't have the time in the right classes to read the whole thing, but maybe a teacher will show you as a follow-up in your class. This is a really ugly document. Basically, it says Germans are depraved, Germans are rapists and killers, Germans are immoral and inhuman, and the German nation is to be destroyed and never be allowed to fight a war. Okay? If you took in this document, every time it says German Americans and put in blacks or Jews or gays or Hispanics, it would be hiding a hate crime. But during war, it worked. You could say, oh yeah, those horrible Germans. Okay. How did you do this? Well, one of the ways was that there was total mobilization. Every person was supposed to support the war, either to save the scraps and to use the lard for explosives. Women and girls were sent out to roll bandages for the soldiers. In a very short time, we went from 0 to 100. We sent millions of soldiers to Europe. And at the same time, the government knew we have to make this possible. We have to hop all these boys up into one kill. So we began this, the Committee for Public Information. Interestingly enough, a lot of women on that committee. This was actually a government committee. This only job was to go around and think of anti-German songs, newspaper articles, campaigns, public displays. There was a second group. Actually, I'm missing the frame. Sorry about that. There was a second and third. We're going to do about a minute. Let me give you a different overview. Well, what I'm trying to study myself, let's look at what History Channel says about this.
The Third War, local governments, civic organizations, and even ordinary citizens began an attack on German Americans and their culture.
There are children who are instructed by their teachers to cut German songs out of the music books that they use in their classrooms. There is a public Stein-breaking fest at one point to keep people from drinking German beer. There's even in one town in Ohio a really gruesome slaughter of German dog breeds. But it's important not to let these ridiculous stories overshadow what is really a wholesale destruction of ethnic culture in the United States.
Germans were pressured to stop playing German music, to stop going to German plays. And when I say Germans, I mean German Americans whose ancestors might have been in this country since before the Revolution. The anti-German hysteria even extended to the federal government. The CPI published an article with tips on how to identify people who were pro-German. The President issued a decree that made any German living in the United States registered as an enemy alien. Almost 500,000 men and women were photographed, fingerprinted, and interrogated about their loyalty to the United States. The program was administered by a 22-year-old member of the Department of Justice, J. Edgar Hoover.
By the way, the older people audience will know this. A lot of the people that were in charge during the Second World War and in my childhood in the 60s and 70s, they got their careers, the career boss in the First World War. J. Edgar Hoover was, I think, he's like 22 years old. He later was a British director of the FBI. Hoover from Iowa, later became president. In fact, there's a story. The IRS was created in 1916, the Federal Reserve Bank system. So a lot of the modern country we have was coined in this period in response to World War I. A lot of the things that we see, or at least we in our youth as every day, had to start here, just like this obscure kid taking over what became the FBI.
By the fall, a new series of camps capable of housing thousands of people had sprung up in Utah, Georgia, and North Carolina. Not to train new recruits, but to imprison anyone that the government considered a threat to its security. There was tremendous pressure on new immigrants to conform, to have American flags, to sing American songs. We welcomed you here. Now you're here, you're with us, and you're only with us.
I wanted to give us some background context for our story. So back to us. So there were these unofficial organizations who were also trying to check everyone was loyal and patriotic and behaved in upstanding ways. For example, there was the National Security League. They were somewhat of a autonomous group that would go around and they would try to, quote, wake up the entire country into service. It was all America, 100% all the time, 100% Americans supposedly. Anything that didn't fall in line was suspect and taboo. Here you see it says serve at home, front, or serve at home. It was all about the war. Young Hoover, for his part, was part of this group and indeed was responsible for getting blankets, clothing, food, and other supplies above all behind the lines in occupied France and Belgium before we were in the war. The second group was the American Protective League. Now this one actually, even though it was also not officially a government body, it had its own badges, and people went around and spied on other people. Here's a report from San Francisco, a cafe that some woman, the daughter of German immigrants, was saying, oh, like tea or coffee and cake, that she didn't want to see all the killing. She thought it was senseless. Why are we fighting and doing all this murder mayhem? She got reported. We saw the American History Channel little video that we had up there. They were living in camps in Georgia and the Carolinas where thousands of German immigrants were sent. They were interned without a lawyer, without a charge. And there's our friend J. Edgar Hoover. He not only was about the business, rounding up Germans that said were unpatriotic, they would literally bring these men together in Newark, New Jersey, at the end of train lines, put them on ships, and send them back to Europe to the war. That wasn't enough, so Hoover had the idea to build these camps, and quite literally, there were thousands of people who just disappeared in these camps in the piney woods of the South, where it's hot, full of mosquitoes, there's malaria, and the Germans didn't want to live in the South anyway, maybe the West, New York. the West Coast. Like in Camp Algona, with the POWs, they literally are building their own camp. They set up gardening because they have something to do. Here's a man who's mending his clothes with pictures of mom and girlfriend back on the wall, like many of you would do if you were at camp. Now, the problem with this internment of all these civilians is we know almost nothing about them. The records were kept secret and then supposedly burned in the National Archives warehouse in St. Louis in 1974. But we've been able to piece together who some of these people were. For example, this violinist was one of 29 members of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. This warrants a little detour. We have to tell the story then of Karl Muck. Karl Muck, who didn't know the German Kaiser was true, had been appointed, brought over to be the conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and quite literally this man, Higgins Ellenson, built his famous musical house on the backs of this one director. Well, the director was the prima donna of the Boston cultural scene. I'm sure it was a bit arrogant, but it's still the truth that he created an amazing musical organization. Now think about it today, all of you kids have iPads and what it is for you to music. Where did your grandparents or great-grandparents get their music? It wasn't on cable in the matter. It was, they went to a live performance, or later, the first phonographs were coming in to play in World War I. So these cut, sometimes wax, cylinders with very bad quality. Every town had an opera house. Charles City had an opera house. Clear Lake, next to the drugstore, which was a kid, had an opera house. Mississippi City had an opera house. I think there's a clothing store. Lisa was an old opera house in Mississippi and Philadelphia. So all these towns, Decorah had several musical venues. Live music was it. Or you had a piano at home, your dad had a fiddle. You didn't just touch a button and swoops there was music. So the Boston Symphony was much more important then than it is today. And for this reason, the FBI, or what became the FBI, had him in the crosshairs. Here's a picture of literally the federal agents arresting Karl Muck and taking him off to Oglethorpe, Georgia, to put him down. Now, what's really interesting, I know you kids are so young and you're all worried about homecoming and your braces and the next day, but when you survive childhood and become an adult, you go out in the world to study. These are really great topics to dig into, because if you dig into this topic, you discover the papers that are released in the archives. It became a witch hunt. So the FBI actually began to interview his girlfriend. He had a 24-year-old soprano as a girlfriend or a wife. They investigated his buying habits, what he was purchasing in the shops. They surveilled him on vacation. So this is the very harbinger of things to come. This was a character assassination. They were looking for a reason to have a scapegoat. Anyway, he and 29 members of his orchestra played at camp. Here's a newspaper that if my articles would allow me to read one of the headlines, and you can see it. This is just after we joined the war in April 1917. All the articles are about hysterical topics. There's the Männer Corps, the men's German choir. Their flag was torn down and the building was torched. This is being ugly. This is no longer just amusing or interesting. It's actually becoming quite dangerous for German Americans. This is a map from the time. This is a legitimate, honest to gosh proposal. They were going to put up a wall around Wisconsin because supposedly all the anti-American, disloyal Wisconsin Germans. And then they also showed this map where were the other heaviest concentrations of German population. Northern Iowa, southwest Minnesota, and initially there were proposals to put a fence around Wisconsin. Now, even before the United States ended the war, German Americans were asking themselves, if a war comes, of course the war already began, we were in it, if we involve in the war, what will happen to us? So here's an article, a cover, a feature of the Vaterland weekly German American newspaper, and they asked, are hyphenated citizens good Americans? Well, Teddy Roosevelt didn't think so. So they said, you're no longer a Hungarian American, Norwegian American, or Irish American, you're just an American. So forget all of your ethnic background, forget your heritage, you're just one of us. Is that the way it works? Anybody know exactly the way it works? What I can tell you is there was tremendous pressure to Americanize. So for example, over north of Algona, west of Forest City, there's a little village called Lakota. In those days it was called Germania. There was so much anti-German feeling, they literally took the names of towns like Germania or Germania, and they said, no, that doesn't work. And then now Lakota, Iowa. Down in Washington, to the town at Eldora, there's a town called Lincoln, Iowa. What was it before this? Berlin, Iowa. So literally, people were pressured to change their family names, to Grue to Green, or something Vault to Woods, and there were consequences if you didn't fall in line. This is, I think, from Herbert Quick, who was also in Iowa. His job was to write propaganda, and he proposed you take every German name out of place names, like Berlin, New Hampshire, or German Woods, or Bismarck, North Dakota, the capital, North Dakota was named the German Chancellor. They really had official programs to clean the map, the American map, any place name the German name in. Here's the little church in Berlin, Iowa. Watch the graphic, it's about to pop up. Out of the door comes a pastor. Why? So, one of the difficulties of doing social history is that there's what really happened and what people remember. And they're not always the same. They're often the same, but not always one-to-one. We do know that the pastor of the Lutheran church in Berlin, Iowa, was harangued because he gave sermons in German. Most of his congregants were German immigrants. But there's also talk that he was taken out and tarred and feathered and rode on a rail. I don't know if it's true, but I think it's true that he was certainly harangued, and he was forced to carry the American flag up and down the street of Berlin, Iowa, singing patriotic songs. That's been documented. Now, where did part of this hysteria come from? How many TVs were in America in 1914, 1915, 16? 0. So people went to the cinema. Even little towns, like probably Floyd had a little movie house at one point. Every town that could had movies, silent movies still, and one was The Birth of the Nation. You'll find this in our next story. And the same guy, D.W. Griffiths, created another propaganda film, Hearts of the World, where of course Lily Gish is this poor little, I think, Belgian peasant girl, and this young, attractive, scrappy American soldier gets behind the German-French lines, capped, and when the Huns, those horrible Germans, overrun the village, of course they raid the village, murder our heroine Lily Gish. It's really all too much. So this committee, and the German Democratic General, was looking to film, was looking to other cultural venues to propagate German hate, and even sheet music, like this one. Don't bite the hand that's feeding you. Why? Again, most middle-class houses in America have a piano. Sheet music was one way to put your message on the keyboard of every living room in the country that had a piano. And it makes it sad. If you don't like this country, get out. It's really that easy in a nutshell. So, this is before the war, sauerkraut days in Germania. During the war, it wasn't just places that changed their names and families that amplified their German surnames to German to English, but even sauerkraut. What was it called during the war? Liberty cabbage. Okay, so no longer eat sauerkraut, went to a restaurant and ordered liberty cabbage. You folks are too young to remember that during the Iraq War, in Congress, they quit serving French fries and served liberty fries. Because the French were willing to fight with us in Iraq. Okay, these stories, unfortunately, are timely. Dachshund became Liberty Dog, and the film is really accurate. The German, quote, races of dogs were murdered, like Rottweilers and Dachshunds and German Shepherds were often publicly executed because of the German dogs. Did you want somebody to kill your dog? Salisbury steak is what used to be hamburger steak. A wiener became a hot dog. Or bratwurst became a hot dog. No longer a wiener or bratwurst. And this little video also illustrates that Johann Schmidt, a local delicatessen owner, had to bend to his pressure as well and became John Smith. Notice the dog is replaced with, quote, an American Bulldog. You can be the That cartoon was comic. This was also sort of funny. TV. The problem is, this is not fiction. What is this? What's happening on the screen? Someone's being tarred and feathered. Folks, there really were German Americans who were tarred and feathered. This is John, or when he came, Johann Mainz, near Laverne, Minnesota. People in the town said he wasn't buying enough Liberty bonds. He was coming to fund the war. He was coming to fund the war largely through pressuring the citizenry to buy bonds. Well, supposedly he wasn't patriotic enough. Twice, neighbors came in the night and took him out. Put a hood over his head, that's why the feathers stopped at his collarbone. And they poured hot tar on his skin. Now, many of you ever go out in summer and step onto a recently paved road? Fresh tar is really hot. Can you imagine it on your skin? What is this? What's happening in the story? What is this? This is a kind of torture. To pour hot oil on someone is torture. And then you throw feathers to say they're cowards, they're chicken. It's really cruel and evil. Alright? So not only were German Americans tarred and feathered, here's another, I think, Minnesota case, again the hood, and then the poured tar. Unfortunately, there were also lynchings. Now I have to give you a footnote. Your teacher talked about the last lynching in Iowa was 1934 in Charles City. Our ancestors were much too quick to jump over the legal system and take justice, so-called, in their own hands. How was they did research, they didn't interview witnesses to a crime. They said that, oh, he did it, or she's the culprit. They went out and struck people up. This is an African-American mother and their son in Oklahoma in 1911. They were accused of having stolen a cow. Well, last year, the only ones who were lynched that period, unfortunately, also whites, like Robert Robert from Dresden. And on the way to the hill of East St. Louis, Illinois, where he was struck up and hung, he was allowed to scribble out quickly a note to his even elderly police on easy to fit. I'm doing this not saying sheriff. It's amazing to me, even elderly police. Okay? So on the way to his death, he lets him write to his parents that he's going to die. Isn't that lovely and generous? Again, this was dressed in funny terms, but it wasn't so funny. So here's some Germans. As this town goes by, us Germans still hang together. Okay? So they mimic the German accent. And this is where I want to drive home prohibition. It was very defeating. All those people who were anti-training. They could tie the topic with the Germans as horrible German Americans. And so here, you've got German-looking stereotypical faces with shouts, with little mustaches, and the Germans were accused through the theater of bringing immorality, laziness, unemployment, spouse abuse, alcoholism, blah, blah, blah. And indeed, there was largely anti-German sentiment that got Congress to pass the Prohibition Act that became part of the Constitution for 2 years. I've given kids three biographical examples of German American culture in this country. Unfortunately, we're not time, so I'm going to sort of skip around. This is Uncle Herman's store west of Osage called Dixie. Herman Trans sells shoes for 50 flat. Did he sell beer in his little general store? I don't know. But what I do know, that seems a young man in the back making 70s in Wisconsin still. I do know that his brother, there's my great-grandfather, right picture of Mike Krantz on his lap. The Trans lived in North Carolina and Mississippi along the Winnebago River. Picture of Victorian prosperity. Notice my grandfather on the porch wearing lederhose and the straps of German clothing. He was born not far from Osage in World War I. The good people of Osage gathered up all the German language books, sheet music, newspapers, magazines, and burned them in a public display of those hateful Germans. That's book burning. 1918, May 1918. It's book burning. Here's some of the results of the Ashes. That's Osage, Iowa. There were book burnings across the country, but we don't have photos of most of them. They were in Davenport, here in Baraboo, Wisconsin, so, yeah, it's Baraboo. Western Hills. This was they put it, and they wrote on the paved blocks, this warning to the Germans left, here lies the remains of Germany in Bearwood High School. German was forbidden to be taught in the Indianapolis school system in Des Moines. They really took out all the German books. It was illegal in many places to use the Grimm Brothers stories like Little Riding Hood or all of those German stories. You couldn't tell fairy tales in English if the author was German. Our governor at the time forbade the use of German on the streets. Now, in his proclamation called the Raleigh Proclamation, he said no foreign languages. Imagine for the Squawky, what I speak now is a foreign language. Anyway, it was really aimed at Germans, so it said no foreign languages. And this was what he wrote. Why he couldn't speak German or Danish on the region streets. Why? Some of you looking at me, Bobby, you should look at there, I'm not going to read it for you, so you should put the pictures in. Do you notice number 4? I find it the most objectionable. Those who couldn't speak English to conduct religious worship in their homes. So here's the governor of Iowa telling Iowans, well, if you don't speak English, tough luck, have church in your living room. Does that work? Is that the way it's supposed to be? So like Mother London, if you don't want to learn English, then have church in your living room. So it did cause a firestorm protest in some ways. Here's letters from a Swedish pastor saying, well, wait a minute, I'm a Swedish pastor, I'm Germans, but my converts don't speak English for communion or for the sermons. There were other letters from civic officials. How are we supposed to enact this anti-German ban? Even President Woodrow Wilson sent a letter from the White House saying, folks, this is going too far. And Iowa was the only state in the Union that banned speaking foreign languages during the war. The governor had to find a yield. There were legal cases. One German record woman said, but my mother, an immigrant, doesn't speak English and she still lives down the mud road. I have to call her every day to find out, does she have medicine, how's she doing? She only speaks English, not German. The law included telephones. You weren't allowed to speak German or Danish or Bohemian on the telephone. What should I do? My mother's sick. I have to know if I should bring more medicine. You know, I'm going to fast forward, sorry about that, this is a good time. Do you know what this is? This is our Iowa State song. Anybody know the hymn, the tune? Oh, Iowa, the tall grows. So what's the tune? Oh, Tannenbaum, da 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 da. So even Iowa State song is a German tune with English words. It wasn't overturned during the war. Okay? So this is how German Iowa once was. The even our state song was a German tune. Iowa with English words. Because people were supposed to speak German or teach German or whatever German, they lost the words. Goethe, Schiller, the fairy tales I told you, Little Red Riding Hood, and the Grimm Brothers, the Pied Piper of Hamelin, all forbidden during the war. But the music, the Des Moines Symphony, refused to play Sebastian Bach or Beethoven. And even Mozart, he wasn't even German, he was Austrian. So all this culture just got wiped out overnight. It was forbidden. Now I've lost my teacher. I need someone to come and run the sheet. This is part 1. What are your questions so far about this story? By the way, the reason this poster is there is that we talk about the rest of that slideshow about how this affected specific people. We're going to talk about that today. Any questions? I'm hoping the adults will jump in. You all have a question. No question? This is your chance.
the hallowed fabric of the American flag, becoming the great fraternal organization of the 1920s.
You had governors and senators and legislators elected with the Klan's blessing, and you also had Chief Justice Black, even the Supreme Court. But he joined the Klan because he felt it was kind of necessary.
Its leaders sought to mask the terror, but the face of intolerance has always dwelled behind the hood. From its birth, the Klan has claimed to be a defender of virtue, the protector of white womanhood, the champion of Christian morals. Masking itself in religion, the Klan stole the holiest of Christian symbols and made it their own. Since 1950, the burning of the cross has been a sacred Klan ceremony. As the 20th century dawned, the Ku Klux Klan was a fading memory. Recollections of the Hooded Order were tainted by popular literature, which portrayed the Invisible Empire as an heroic force, simply battling to maintain the proper social order. This fanciful remembrance would help fuel the Klan's revival. On Thanksgiving Eve, 1915, 16 men gathered atop Stone Mountain in Georgia. As night fell, a towering cross was ignited and the Ku Klux Klan was reborn. The organizer of the spectacle was a preacher-turned-salesman named William Joseph Simmons.
Colonel William J. Simmons was a failed Methodist clergyman who had left the cloth in order to become a fraternal organizer.
Simmons claimed the idea of starting a new Klan came to him in a vision. The birth of the group was simply a matter of timing. The moment arrived with the release of one of the greatest cinematic achievements of its time. But Klan publicists devised a sales pitch based on the slogan, 100% Americanism. The new Klan would be a patriotic organization for American-born white Protestants only. It was no longer enough for the Klan to be anti-black. It now had Jews, Catholics, and immigrants to its list of enemies. The recruitment strategy was a spectacular success. Within 15 months, the Klan enrolled more than 100,000 new members. The Klan had tapped a fear in millions of Americans.
In the 20s, a strong portion of America felt invaded. They felt invaded by immigrants. Catholics were growing in number, and they felt that America was no longer the America they knew.
Riding a wave of publicity from the newspaper exposés and congressional hearings, the Klan burst out of the South in an incredible surge of growth. Clamours arose in every state of the Union. New members willingly paid a $10 initiation fee for the privilege of donning the robe and hood. Klan recruiters used the Protestant church to their full advantage. They persuaded local ministers to join the Klan by offering free membership and a position of leadership. Klansmen would then make a mysterious call on the congregation.
With prior ways invited in the district, they would appear during the service on Sunday morning, make a donation to the church, which the minister would receive and bless, and then they would withdraw, and the people would know that the Klan was now down.
When the Klan wrapped its message in the sacred symbols of Christianity and the hallowed cloth of the American flag, it found new members easily induced to join.
In order to recruit, the Klan has to have a message that's powerful. And if the Klan message was, join the Klan and we'll let you black, or we'll burn a building, the very few people would join the Klan. But so the Klan kind of cloaks its goals and good and Christian and right and moral and just and patriotic purposes.
By 1922, 3 million white Americans had joined the Hooded Order. The stereotype of Klan members as unschooled and savage is inaccurate. Klan membership in the 1920s represented a cross-section of the white Protestant community. At the same time American women were demanding equal rights, women who supported Klan ideals demanded entrance into the invisible empire. Their overtures resulted in the formation of the Women of the Ku Klux Klan and other women Klan organizations. At its height, 500,000 women were members of the Ku Klux Klan. With millions now counting themselves as members of the hooded order, the Ku Klux Klan became the great social organization for much of white Protestant America in the 1920s. The Klan demonstrated its popularity with its own form of pageantry, many street parades. The marches were exhibitions of might and spectacle. As Klan membership rolls grew, so did its political power. In the national arena, the Klan helped to elect 16 United States senators, 5 of whom were sworn Klan members. One of the 5, Hugo Black, recanted his allegiance when he later became a Supreme Court justice. From California to New Jersey, voters elected Klan-backed candidates to a variety of statewide and local offices.
You couldn't run for public office in some places unless you had Klan endorsement and Klan support, because it had this enormous membership, and it enjoyed the sympathy of non-members who may not have always condoned the most horrific brutal acts, but who thought the Klan served a role in helping tamp down these visible elements of society.
A couple things I want you guys to think about. So before World War I, we basically treated our German immigrants as if they were what? As what? As they were spies, as an enemy, right? Tomorrow when we're in class, we'll discuss how in every war after that, we've done that to a degree. Right? Probably the worst one that we ever did in our history was we interned Japanese Americans in World War II. What I want you guys to do, as you look at all those images of the KKK marching, last summer in America, we have stuff that was similar.
Yes.
Yeah, we have seen what we did. Something I bet Mrs. Downey is addressing, but something I know I've stressed in my classes, is that history goes in this wave. Right? And the same things kind of repeat and come back up. And the ideas behind them, they're consistent. We got to ask ourselves as citizens and as like just people who think, why? Why do they constantly repeat? What do we need to change? You know, KKK's power is less than it was in 1920. What is it that changed to make that little bit of a difference? You know, we keep building from that, so it's not always the exact same. That history can change. Oh yeah, hey, remember, what did that video say? Who was the KKK against? African Americans? Yeah. Catholics, immigrants, people who are Jewish. Raise your hand if you're Catholic. All you guys would fall into that boat. You know?
It's one of the points I want to raise, the connection between World War I and this. What were they doing in World War I? And this is why it makes such a powerful story. They took the majority I thought he was going to say they were second-class citizens, because the way German Americans were. But above all, those committees and those propaganda efforts, they were generating hate. The government and its allied bodies were generating hate against Germany. 1917, 18. These stories of the Klan are from the early 20s. What were they doing? Generating hate against whom? Blacks, of course, but also Catholics. Catholics, as you said, Jews. I think they're anti-Mason as well, so their grandparents were in the Mason Lodge. So anybody who was, quote, 100% American, whatever that means, was not wanted and was suspect, it was dangerous. So these two stories, what bonds them the most is anti-German, anti-Catholic. Many of the German Americans were Catholics. So when the Americans said, oh, we hate Catholics, how convenient. They were beside us. They hate movies, so the Catholics were in the war. They're Catholics at all. The war's over. It's Catholic. All right? Let's talk about the Klan. Any quick questions? All right, so this is called the second wave. I want to talk briefly about the white cancer, American Surplus Klan, and we cannot understand the second wave without first looking at the first wave. So the first wave arose after the Civil War, which ended in 1865, and the first wave, these really were sort of novices. Later in interviews, the founders of the KKK claimed it was a joke. That's why they took these outlandish names like the Conclaves and the Royal Grand Dragons and whatever else, but it wasn't funny. They said that they weren't serious, but it had serious consequences. Their followers, and soon there were many throughout the South, the defeated Confederate States, Dixie, they looked like novices. They were a ragtag bunch. But what they did was quite serious. For example, here's a newspaper story or ad in a Southern paper. It's from 1868. What's the message? So the Democratic Party's mascot is a donkey. Republicans still an elephant. The message was, we're going to kick your ass, okay? And these are carpetbaggers. What was a carpetbagger? Anybody? Even an adult room? I don't know who you are, but
yeah, I do. Those are people came down from the door, either to help former slaves find employment or a place to live, or some came down for economic opportunity.
This woman is a Klan. She was my high school English and journalism teacher. But yes, she's right. So the carpetbaggers were northerners who came down after the destruction of the South to find economic opportunities to help African Americans adjust to not being slaves. But there's a second term up there, scalawags. It talks about carpetbaggers and scalawags. What are scalawags? Anybody know what a scalawag was, or is? I suppose it was. Southern whites who cooperated with the carpetbaggers. They were also seen as treasonous. So here you've got this ragtag group going around putting anonymous messages with death threats. If you northerners don't get out of here, we're going to kill you. Again, they ran around the night, terrorizing not just blacks but whites in the north or cooperating with southerners, with disastrous consequences. These are all children who were lynched. A tree full of lynched children. What's going on here?
That's so strange.
If you look, though, at the Klan of the 1860s, 70s, you see how influenced it looks and how novice lives are amateur life. The Klan of the 20s was a legal way. The second way of the Klan, those were professionals. They hired a publicity firm in Atlanta to actually do their public relations. The film pointed out they couldn't just go around saying, oh, join the Klan, we're going to go kick some dark people and we're going to hang you. That wouldn't have worked for a lot of folks. But they took it other causes. Kick a Catholic or, string up a Jew or I don't know whatever. They expanded their scope. So as of 1915 until the end of World War II, we have the second wave. Again, it was the idea, America for Americans. I don't know what the Native Americans would have said about that, but here's when your membership forms. You have to fill out this form to join, and it was a questionnaire. And I'm afraid it's sort of hard for you guys to read it. But it was, do you believe in white supremacy? What is your politics? What is your religious faith? What church are you a member? What secret fraternal orders are you a member of? Well, there were enough people in Iowa that joined the call. This is Greenfield, Iowa, down where John Wayne was born. Hundreds of people. To this day, when I do programs there, in the community center, at the bottom of the chairs say gift to the local KKK. All right? We know the KKK was active in Mason City, as soon as Charles City, through throughout the region. And the KKK spread quickly, as the film said. Let me show you here, for example, in 1915, that offspring next being Eve. Then you see how it spreads. World War I ends. America becomes ridiculously prosperous. Throughout the Ohio River Valley spreads throughout the lower south, and then boom, in 23, throughout the Midwest. Into the West, even Canadian provinces had clan conclaves up in the prairie provinces. Industrial cities, New York, Cleveland, Philadelphia, Boston, Washington. Then the Depression hits, and the new conclaves are far fewer, and they're spread out over more distance. The war is moving on the horizon. This is the aggregate. These are where the clan conclaves, or something called clubs, were in that period. Now you saw this fellow in the film about Angela Hysteria. This is W. Griffiths again. I'm hoping that your estimable teacher will show you the film Rise of the Birth of a Nation. It really rallied the country. It excited people. It was cinematographically a really well-made film. Unfortunately, most of the African American folks were blackface, so the whites were pretending to be black. They had Lillian Gish, one of the leading actresses of Hollywood in that period. She was kidnapped with her friend, an historian. And this film was a blockbuster. People stood in lines for hours to go to this film. Even the president saw this film in the White House, a special showing, and he's quoted in the film. The white men were aroused by American secret self-preservation. Till at last it had sparked into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. Your teacher, hopefully, I'll give a copy of the slideshow, he'll come back to these, but the idea of self-preservation from whom? Who were these whites in the South supposedly protecting themselves? It's a good question. A lot of this is just typed up. Still, the consequences were real. As African American officers from World War I began coming back, they dared wear the uniforms in public, and the South would be hung for that. Why? Why would you castigate someone for wearing a U.S. soldier uniform? Well, there was a large rumor that these African Americans were going to rise up. In fact, if you Google Wikipedia, Red Summer 1919, there were hundreds of riots raging small across the country, and whites were terrified that these, quote, enlightened Bolsheviks would come back on the ships from the front of Europe and see dissent. And indeed, in Chicago in 1919, there was this tragic incident. A young man got shot. He drifted from the African American part of the beach to the white beach. It was segregated. He was killed. That began days of riots. The militia was called out and occupied South Chicago. Notice the veteran soldier on the left in uniform talking to the white militia guy. And this is exactly why in the South, the racists were killing black men who dared to wear their U.S. Army uniform. Imagine you come back and you're black and you've been defending your country abroad in your uniform in the Army's own clothes, and someone gives you grief. So the only one talking back is somebody in uniform, and that's what whites are afraid of. You can explain later the idea of quoting another nigger, all right? So they want to put black people down at any cost, to humiliate them, to take away their power. This is what this is all about. And it gives them a uniform, it's a sign of respect, and it gives them a higher standing. This is what a lot of white folks were terrified of. So here in South Side Chicago being occupied, they have honey blacks in the backyards, the white men teams would chase African Americans, stone them. They burned African homes. Now, I don't know about other people in the room, when I grew up in Northern Iowa in the 60s and 70s, we thought that the Southerners were racist. We, Northern whites, were white, we weren't racist. This is a story of Omaha, Nebraska, and there are African Americans. This is Will Brown, he was brought out during the war to work in the packing plants in Omaha. Long story very short, he was accused of molesting German young girl, Agnes Rowley. The sheriff took him downtown. The next morning, a mob gathered, took him mob grabbed the mayor, the white mayor, and hung him on the lamppost. He almost died. The sheriff came and cut him down, put him in the car and drove him off. The mayor was in the hospital for 10 days. He almost had a broken neck. This is serious. People felt very strong about all this, whites and blacks. The day afterwards, the mayor's office was still smoking from having been torched. The building had been assaulted. The Red Cross stayed to the damage of the Red Cross office. And what now stands in the historical record, the older folks in the room will know who Henry Fonda was. Some of you know his daughter, Jane Fonda. She's not a show on Broadway. He was 14 years old at the time. His father had a treatment plant across the street from the courthouse. His father sent home the workers, turned off the lights and shut the blinds, and made his son watch this lynching. And afterwards, they drove home in the car, and Henry Fonda later wrote his biography, his memoir. It was the saddest day of my life to watch this young man murder this little way. Those people left deep impressions. Since we're still casting a big West because we think that we're living in the Southern Whites, this is the story of circus workers in Duluth, Minnesota in 1920. Again, the rumor that they had molested this blonde girl. By the way, her own doctor could not prove that she was raped. It said, I don't see signs of rape. At any rate, the people of Duluth chased down the 3 circus workers and found them. At this point is where we normally go on to tell a different story, but we don't have time. What is the story that I'm going to tell today? Who's the guy on the top right? Any clues? It's my great-grandfather. So, family history is a very dangerous, slippery thing. But 3 of my dad's cousins told me in interviews that their mother, my dad's Aunt Nona, went out as a girl in her 20s to the barn and found on the rafters the white Ku Klux Klan robe and the pointing hat. Now, I knew my great-grandfather. I was named after him, George Michael Louis. So when I'm in Germany giving these lectures, I ask the kids, how is it for you to discover that your great-grandfather was a Nazi or the SS? Some of you have people who were the KKK. There are millions of members. It's unavoidable statistically. Some of you also have that in your family. What do we do with this history? I'm not guilty. I have a responsibility. You can't blame me. I wasn't around. I knew that. I must have felt it. It was a great sweet ride. Which brings up the other point I want to say before we go. Even people you love, good people, can do stupid things. So your task as adults, as you leave high school and go to college, what you're going to do and have lives and families of your own, is how can you be a good person to avoid doing stupid things? One of the things you can do is not believe all the lies that come from this corner, that corner, about those dangerous immigrants, or those horrible Jews, or those congregate people, or Catholics, or whatever the group is. Always question kind of hateful comments and ask why you're saying that. What's that based on? What's your problem? Because in reality, we're a very diverse planet. There are lots of people in the world. And who's to say we don't belong here, you're bad, because the way you were born? Thanks a lot for your attention. I'll give it back to your teachers.